What do you think when I say the words epic fantasy? For many, you may think of something like this.
You shall not pass!
Or this. And maybe even this.
How shall you deal with me, O Prince, and all the powers of hell?
But what about epic fantasy as it stands today? It's true, fantasy is commonly thought of as a genre of the past. However, it's gaining momentum once more, and it's happening through television. In the past decade, shows like Game of Thrones, The Witcher, and Carnival Row have proven that we are on the precipice of a fantasy renaissance. But with every pop culture boom in a given genre, there will always be creative works that go unnoticed, and many more that will fail. Most of these productions get marked off as poorly developed or low quality, but today we'll be talking about a hidden gem of the epic fantasy genre. A show with an emotional story, rich lore, and lots of puppets. Some of you may have heard of The Dark Crystal before. Ah yes, the strange cult movie from the 80s that terrified me as a child. And you wouldn't be wrong. The original Dark Crystal film is somewhat of a fever dream. While watching it as an adult, it's an easy view with a cool exploration of puppets in a captivating fantasy realm. But from the point of view of a child, it presents a convincing argument that the guy who created Super Grover may not have had your best interests in mind. Yeah, those puppets are definitely creepy. However, despite mixed impressions from the original film, in 2017, Netflix announced that they would be working with the Jim Henson Company to produce a prequel series. The show would be titled The Dark Crystal and the Age of Resistance, headed by Louis Leterrier. The first season of the show debuted in August of 2019 to raving reviews. Many journalists praising the blend of CGI animation with classic puppetry, along with a fantastic voice cast and story. But in late 2020, it was announced due to low viewership, massive budget requirements, and coronavirus, the show would not receive a second season. Which is a shame. The Dark Crystal Age of Resistance was clearly a creation of immense thoughtfulness and love for the epic fantasy genre, both breaking the norms and reminding viewers why we humans love the fantastical. In this video, I hope to illustrate how the Dark Crystal achieved this feat, and why it deserves more recognition than it originally received. Epic fantasy is traditionally defined as fantasy with an emphasis on a large presence of magic and mythical creatures. Additionally, the narrative is concerned with large-scale events like the apocalypse or worldwide warfare. All of this is seen in the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance, along with other staples of the fantasy genre, such as combat, magical sages, forces of ultimate evil, castles, new creatures, and magical items. Nonetheless, the definition and checklist may have been a little bit baseline. There are other aspects that make an epic fantasy an epic fantasy. The word epic in storytelling terms normally discusses a long narrative poem, following the life of a heroic adventurer on the path to fulfill their prophecy. Examples of this would be the Epic of Gilgamesh or Homer's The Odyssey. This proves to be true for the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance as well. Audience follow Rian, Bree, and Deet as they try to use their special gifts and fulfill their prophecy to save the planet Thra from destruction. Yet the correlation between the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance epic to other epic fantasy TV shows is even stronger. To get more specific, the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance ways of conveying this epic fit in line with other fantasy TV shows rather than just the epic fantasy genre. When we compare the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance to two moguls in the epic fantasy genre, Game of Thrones and The Witcher, we can see all three shows' creative teams convey their epic narrative through employing multiple storylines. The shows balance 3 or more different key plot lines following characters in all different places scattered about the fantasy world that all eventually intertwine. Additionally, each character normally falls into an archetype of the fantasy genre, For Dark Crystal, these plotlines or characters are Rian, the knight that is trying to prove his worth to the Resistance; Bree, a princess who is reluctant to conform to the ways of the monarchy, searching for wisdom; and Deet, a farm girl with the hidden ability to use magic. Now let's look at The Witcher. Geralt is a paladin to an ancient order, trying to cure the world of monsters. Ciri is a runaway princess with intelligence beyond her years. And lastly, Yennefer is a farm girl taken away from her family and trained in the art of sorcery. Sounds similar, right? Game of Thrones is the same. Jon Snow as Rian, Arya as Bree, and Daenerys as Deet. While these plotlines, of course, are not mirrored images of each other, and by the end of the series, they are all very different. Their connections cannot be ignored. While the narrative archetypes and implementation of multiple plotlines in The Dark Crystal is fairly common with other fantasy series, there is one facet where The Dark Crystal goes above and beyond its peers, and that is in world building. The species, landscapes, and cultures developed by both Jim Henson and Louis Leterrier are holistically original. For starters, the creative teams invented 4 new humanoid fantasy species: the Gelflings, Mystics, Podlings, and the Skeksis. Unlike other fantasy TV shows with elves, dwarves, or fairies, viewers come into the show without any knowledge of these races or their cultures, which opens their eyes to a new type of fantasy experience. This extends to every non-humanoid creature as well, down to the tiniest insect. Each one is an animal the audience has never seen before. When we compare this again to shows like Game of Thrones or The Witcher, sure, both series depict fantastical creatures and cultures, but each one is one the audience has heard before. For example, both Game of Thrones and The Witcher have dragons and sorcerers, but these creatures are derivative of fantasy stories dating back to the dawn of storytelling. Unlike what we see in The Dark Crystal, where each creature was designed carefully by the creative team, and not based upon creatures we've seen in previous writings. I know, Thra, the world of The Dark Crystal, may seem a little bit daunting to dive into. The creative team put an immense amount of effort into using cinematography, set design, and lighting as a means to get audiences accustomed to this world. And wow, it is beautiful. Just look at some of these shots. Presumably, the cinematographer Eric Wilson, production designer Gavin Bouquet, and head director Louis Leterrier are responsible for this, and it really is amazing. Shooting puppets is also specifically difficult, as the sets need to be elevated so performers can control the characters' movements from underground. It can also be a struggle to hide the performers, and the fact that the puppets have limited movements, especially in the legs. However, Eric Wilson's pushed the limitations to the extreme and used some incredibly creative camera work. Again, let's compare this to Game of Thrones and The Witcher.
Go.
We will defeat it. The darkness that will swallow the dawn.
I have to find Geralt of Rivia.
Don't judge me.
They say witches can't feel human emotion. What do you believe in?
Evil is evil.
I don't know about you, but it's not necessarily as captivating. I'm by no means trying to say the camera work or production design from either of these shows are bad, but they're a lot more generic of other action shows. Maybe it's simply the demand for artificially crafted sets or cartoony puppets, but I feel like The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance really shows the potential of what fantasy can be. While the battle scenes in Witcher are unmatched, and the goriness and all-out war of Game of Thrones are incredible spectacles, are they really great tropes of what makes something fantasy? If viewers can sustain the disbelief to watch a dragon burn down a giant ice wall, or a guy transform from werewolf to human, why do creators draw the line at first-person POV shots or physics-defying castles? Or even just a really, really stylized tree? It's no secret no show can get everything right, and I'm not trying to say The Dark Crystal Age of Resistance does. I would actually say there's a few points where it fails as a fantasy series, one of which would be the non-diegetic music or background score. It's extremely forgettable. It isn't bad by any means, and it doesn't take me out of the show, but I would argue that every good fantasy TV show and movie has a really strong backing score. Game of Thrones, The Witcher, and Lord of the Rings are an excellent example of the impactful music. I could hum each of their main themes on command, but not the Dark Crystals. The only music I do remember is when the enslaved podlings were playing drums for the Skeksis, but the only reason I remembered it was because it was diegetic and being played in the show's reality. Similarly, and this is a bit more nitpicky, but the characters are somewhat hard to empathize with simply because they are puppets. While technology can go a long way in 36 years, the Henson Company puppets are still slaves to the uncanny valley. Sometimes their mouths just don't move perfectly and their eyes can be soulless, similar to the CGI in the Polar Express. And this is kind of how puppets are. And I would argue it's not necessarily fixable, and it doesn't necessarily discount from the show, but it does make the characters feel a little bit distant, despite the amazing voice cast. Like I said at the start of the video, the epic fantasy genre is on the rise, and I'm super excited to see where it goes next. I mean, who wouldn't be thrilled if their favorite genre was at the top of the pop culture hierarchy? But I'm also really nervous, because interest in epic fantasy won't last forever, and genres can get extremely boring to watch over and over again. Look at superheroes, for example. The superhero content market is so oversaturated and generic that many people have just stopped keeping track of the genre altogether. Heck, there are even well-known formulas of how each studio produces a superhero TV show and film. I love the initial Marvel superhero TV shows, and similarly, I love more generic fantasy shows like The Witcher and Game of Thrones. But I also really like The Dark Crystal, and I would love to see more whimsical exploratory fantasy where the creative team is given free rein and able to explore their imaginations to the fullest. It's the only way to keep audiences interested in the fantasy genre long term, coming back again and again to explore their more whimsical, what-if fairy tale side. And also, who doesn't want more creepy puppets? Thanks for watching.